Meet the 10 richest people of our time, from the owner of Louis Vuitton to the founder of Microsoft. Their combined wealth is greater than the economies of Norway and Austria together. Yet today, 700 million people live below the poverty line. It would seem that the world has long since ended slavery and feudalism, but inequality has only increased. 1% of the population owns half the world's wealth. Each person at the top of the pyramid earns over $1 million a year, while half of the people on the planet settle for 1% of the economic pie. How did this happen? To find out, you have to go back 200 years. Until the 18th century, the main source of wealth was land, and it belonged to the nobility, a privileged group of people. Almost the entire population was peasants who worked on other people's land and barely made ends meet. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the world was changing. The emergence of new technologies, the development of trade and credit, and the consolidation of cities led to the fall of the feudal system and provoked an industrial revolution. The new businesses and industries of the European economy needed fuel, which they found in the skills of their successful and powerful neighbors. Using their military and technological might, European states seized territories in Asia, Africa, and the Americas and began to siphon off resources, from gold and diamonds to coffee and tobacco. Using the cheap labor of the natives and selling their goods to the colonies, Europe rapidly grew richer. Each empire used its leverage, but Britain, the world's economic leader at the time, was particularly successful. The jewel in the British crown was India. Huge reserves of raw materials, a favorable geographic location, and a large population made India the most valuable colony in the world, and the British exploited it to the fullest. Here's one example. In the mid-19th century, the textile industry was booming. Mechanical looms were in widespread use, productivity was increasing, and raw materials were becoming scarce. So, Britain banned the export of Indian cotton to other countries and began buying it from its colony at monopolistically low prices. The embargo on the export of India's most important commodity led to widespread poverty as workers in the key industry, from farmers to weavers, lost their source of income. Of course, while buying Indian cotton at low prices, Britain sold finished goods to India at world-class prices. The legacy of the colonial economy was felt for many years after India declared independence. By the end of the 20th century, half of the country's population lived below the poverty line. But while India is now climbing out of the poverty trap, most African countries remain there. What is wrong with them? Take Nigeria, the continent's richest country in terms of oil reserves. It would seem that it's possible to build a strong economy with the world's most important resource, but few people succeed because countries are subject to the resource curse. Nigeria's problem is complicated by the fact that 1/3 of the country's black gold is pumped not by Nigerian entrepreneurs, but by transnational corporations such as Shell and Total. Just so you understand the big picture, African multinationals' African profits are 3 times the amount of international aid that flows to the entire continent. So colonial relations have not gone away, they have just become different. The dominant economies move factories to poor countries, where cheap local labor is hired and cheap local resources are siphoned off. As a result, people in sub-Saharan Africa are not just poor, they are beggars, literally living on $2 a day. The difference between poverty and destitution was once succinctly described by Dostoevsky. In poverty, you still retain the nobility of your innate feelings, but in poverty, you are never and no one. Okay, the poorest countries have been dealt with, they're mostly former colonies. But what about the rest of the world? Take any European or CIS country and compare it with the Congo or Somalia. The difference will be obvious, of course, but it does not mean that there are no poor in Europe or America, just that it is a different kind of poverty. If a resident of the Congo can't buy a car, he doesn't care because everyone there walks. However, a resident of the European side without money for a car would be considered relatively poor, and such poverty is well disguised. You may not even notice it. In the world's most developed countries, with the exception of a dozen small super-rich nations, most people can't buy a house without a mortgage, keep 2 cars per family, or fly on vacations every month, and nothing in their lives changes much. Even if the economy grows by a few percent every year. Where does that growth go? Into the incomes of the richest. Don't believe me? I'll show you. To understand how the average person's life changes as the economy grows, we need to look at how the economic success of recent decades has been distributed. To do this, economists use the Gini coefficient. The closer it is to 1, the higher the income stratification of people, and the closer it is to 0, the more equal everyone lives. So, the world dynamics of the Gini coefficient show that inequality has increased over the last 200 years. For example, the world economy is certainly getting richer, but not for everyone. What is the practical manifestation of this inequality? Most of our wealth is in bank deposits and real estate. Yes, some people invest in securities, but more often it is retirement savings that constitute an enviable reserve. But the wealth structure of the richest 10% of people is very different. They own a real business. Real estate accounts for only a third of their assets, and most of their wealth is in financial assets. And the richer people are, the higher this share is. The rich do not spend their income when it increases, but it makes no sense. They have enough to live on. The increase in their wealth comes at the expense of the increase in the value of their financial assets. But most of us, after receiving a raise, will increase our consumption to escape relative poverty. Buy a new phone, upgrade the car, or buy an apartment. Can you feel the difference? So let's introduce progressive taxes, an advanced observer will say. Taxes are indeed the main instrument of equalization, but throughout the 20th century, they gradually affected the poor. Here's how it worked. From the 50s to the 80s, the average top income tax rate in developed countries was 72%, and in Britain it was 95%. It's like if you made $1 million a month, but gave $950,000 of it to the government. Naturally, the rich began to evade these taxes by transferring their money into these very financial assets and offshore companies. The Laffer curve worked. When tax rates become too high, people would rather risk going to jail for evasion than voluntarily giving away such sums. As a result, the top rates fell, and today they average 40%. But the decline had to be offset by something, and it was offset by an increase in excise taxes, which fell on whom? Exactly, on the poor. Because unlike the rich, the poor cannot split up their business, buy a share in a company, or buy an expensive painting to hide their income. The main sources of income for most people are salaries and pensions, which are automatically taxed, and the rest of the money the middle class and the poor have to spend almost entirely on living. There is no room for real investment. It is a vicious circle. Former and current colonies are condemned to poverty, while developed countries are mired in inequality. Can anything be done about it? In fact, the situation is beginning to change. In the early 1990s, 38% of the world's population lived below the poverty line. Today, it is only 8%. This is because over the past 30 years, especially in the 90s, the global economy has grown. The internet has emerged and education has become more accessible. But the gains in recent years have been more modest, which means that poverty will fall more slowly. It is extremely difficult for poor countries to escape the colonial trap. In such countries, children cannot get a proper education, not only because there are no good schools, but also because instead of learning, they have to spend time fetching clean water and food. For countries with any kind of economy, politics becomes an obstacle. Long-standing territorial conflicts and corrupt officials trying to loot more in their short century destroy the chances for the country to get out of poverty. No one will ever invest in such an economy, which means that without a strong leader who will preferably discover oil in his territory or exploit some other unique resource, it is simply impossible to get out of the poverty trap. When a country overcomes absolute poverty, it falls into relative poverty, because higher rates of economic success do not mean equal distribution of wealth. Consider Nigeria, the richest country in Africa in terms of GDP. Among rich countries, only in Northern Europe do people live relatively equally. High taxes, as we have seen, only exacerbate inequality. So we have to use other economic levers. This is not to say that governments are not working in this direction. They set minimum wages, allocate quotas for free education, try to get into anti-monopoly regulations, but things move slowly, mainly because the conductor of the main economic decisions is still the rich upper class, which pushes its interests. Put yourself in their place. Would you agree to a law that would reduce your income? I'm not going to play the role of Robin Hood, nor am I going to fight for everything good against everything bad. You have to be realistic. You can only get out of relative poverty by yourself. Regardless of where you live, getting an education and constantly learning new things are not empty words. They are the only way to become a sought-after worker and escape the poverty trap. Do not wait for the weather and for someone to come and give you a suitcase full of money. Modern economy is a fight for your piece of the cake, and today you have to take it yourself. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share in the comments if you feel poor. We'll see how many of us there are.